Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 21. Of all the things I have said regarding the Seleukid War, if war is the correct term for what was taking place, only a distilled and faded impression was able to travel as far as Apollon. Most readers of messages and cultivators of rumour were looking for a simple point. Was the war going poorly or well? What was happening could only be interpreted as the latter, for the war could not be going poorly if people were actively colonizing the front lines, and if magical rituals were enlivening the spirits of all men through the patronage of Yumo. All the contradictions that came with distant observation of chaotic events were not any handicap to the generation of a positive impression. You might think that the king himself would take issue with the notion that so many important decisions were being made without his counsel. Often it is said that he did provide this counsel. This is a mistake by those who overestimated the king's reach. Pairisades was not very concerned with anything that he did not see in person. Granted, the greater portion of his empire he had indeed seen, and attended to directly at one point or another. The Eastern Theatre was the foremost exception. The king was content to have his son be his first representative there, and arrangements were being made to empower the frontiersman Aeneas with the rank of Witness of the King, so that Aeneas would be king of his own realm in most respects if he obligingly followed the empire's doctrine, and to some extent the fluid doctrine of any Scions of Gold scholars who took the chance to go to the new Museum of History in Hekatompilos. You may recall that a man named Kilix had been granted this same power. As a matter of course, he was subtle and light in his influence, because he did not want to muddle the already spiral-threaded shawl of authority strung up between the different cities, officers, royals, and client tribes. In truth, I would say that most people thought it was muddled beyond muddling already. Whether it was this concept that changed his attitude, I cannot say, although I judge it plausible. That his attitude changed is certain, because we have record of him appearing in Pannonia in early 169 prior to pass judgment in a series of loud criminal matters concerning the leaders of slave mobs refusing their duty. The cause of this unrest was actually the nobility and honour of the king. Allow me to explain this. Pairisades can be readily described by the phrase, "a foreigner nowhere and everywhere." This term emerged from a comment made by a chieftain of the Doreius, after which scholars took a liking to it. I concur, and add further that the veracity of the phrase is uncovered in the king's attitude to the law. What Spartacus had begun by way of simplifying and unifying the endless legal traditions of the patchwork empire, Pairisades took and carried on to a place of almost childish simplicity, a single legal code for all the people of the world. I have said before that this was a compromise on Golden Age ideals, and it is true that if this feat could be achieved, then the Golden Age would undoubtedly be imminent. However, Pairisades' method of beginning the process was only to decree it so. In other words, he declared that all men be equal, and then carried on with his own business, as if nothing of importance or action had been said. That was his way. Efforts began to manifest to progress his goal, and on balance it was a well-liked idea, even if it rarely achieved any practical changes to the rights and fates of the people. The important point for the case of Pannonia was that slaves were not covered by the extensions of rights being proffered, since that would be a disastrous shock to farming and shipping, and hence injure slave and citizen alike. Pannonia was awash with slaves from the Getae Wars, who were now being put to work in rebuilding the extinct Silurian civilization, so that the cycle of soil and man would restart in those charred places. When these slaves found out that their families and countrymen in Daxia were beginning to receive lavish rights, usually reserved for the first-rank citizens of important cities, such as the ability to make sacrifices in their own homes, and to draw from the state armories for the security of private business, there was uproar and a claim that slavery itself should be legislated away by the same spirit the king was championing. That was a misreading of what the king intended, and furthermore the very sort of short-sighted idea which a slave is positioned to have of his own role in society. Since their condition of slavery was not actually in violation of any law, their legalistic protests were utterly hopeless, and this they failed to digest. The king himself paid all this no heed, since he was away achieving feats I shall record for you next. So it was left to Felix to come and rectify all the theft and stoppages of work among the slaves. His solution was as simple as all of his rulings. He ordered the foremost slave representatives publicly executed, and then issued proclamations to reaffirm the truth of the law. With this work done, he is next recorded as attending a symposium in Apollon, of no importance to any outside the circles who partook in those rowdy gatherings. I dare say it was obvious even at the time that the matter of servile disobedience had not only been left unsolved, but perhaps had been worsened by the loudening of complaints and inflaming of fury that Felix's show of force commenced. These were matters that future leaders of the empire would have to tackle head-on. As for the leader of the empire at the time, Pairisades was not the type of man to connect to those he could not quickly convince to like him, and this roguish complex of his made him a rather detached ruler when his vision was not enacted smoothly. In this case, he simply dismissed the potential of an uprising or breakdown of communications and carried on with his current project. That was to coddle his son Aristippus and subjugate Himanian tribes to the service of the Golden Age cause. For Pairisades there was no use in pursuing the latter without the former, as he had been awakened to his dynastic responsibilities, and therefore wished to have capable and famous sons who might rule as he did. Since he had Doraeus, his focus on Aristippus was misplaced, you may note, and the reason for this was because Pairisades liked secretly to see how his son could not live up to his name, demonstrating the value of the senior's life and legacy with surer contrast. How do I know this? Because Pairisades let rumours to this effect swell in his wake with his casual style among courtiers, no matter the discipline Diotrephes had spent a lifetime attempting to enforce in the Spartacid column. I say all this to introduce that Paracetes was at Kimbri during 169, guiding Aristippus in training an army of Himanian converts, who were given citizenship faster and lured with promises of magic protection, promises that were not false, I would argue. During the summer, this army was put to the test, some say, and I will now proceed to say otherwise. Here is what happened. From the north, where the forests are darker yet thinner, there came an enormous army of a people who are usually called the Kimbri. It would be reasonable to call them Himanians, and indeed it might even be more reasonable than it is for most of the minor people of Europe, because it was from the Kimbri that many of the traits linked to the Himanians originated. This happened over a period of 5 centuries of invasions and migrations from north to south, mixing the Kimbri into all the other tribes, and even into the Dacians and Italics. It is from the tribes subjected to these invasions that the word Kimbri originates, meaning something like thieves in many of the Himanian dialects. Since the Kimbri were happy to call themselves by this title, one wonders if the cultural prothesis took place in reverse also. The Kimbri sought to profit from the disorder of the conquered lands, not realizing that they were in reality more ordered than before. Pairisades bade Aristippus go and face this army down with the new Himanian companies, and so the son loyally took those men from Kimbri and camped on the thin road that breached the forests and created a barely usable pass. Pairisades then came and asked Aristippus if the camp was in a good position, and Aristippus said he wanted to camp as close to the edge of his territory as possible, to ensure he fought the enemy quickly. I think in truth he had been led there by elements among his army who wanted every opportunity to escape into the woods and defect when the enemy arrived. This is only my speculation though, given the scheming nature of the Himanians. The king ordered the camp be placed back outside the forests on a barren hilltop, where the ground was windswept and thin, the sort of place that is valued in the Black Forests as much as an oasis is in a desert, to those who were not at peace with the forest at least. The reports from the time will say that the Kimbri came upon the Bosporan camp, trembled with fierce terror, and scattered into the woods where animals and natural maladies claimed too many to count. As I have told you before, this is the sort of thing Pairisades arranged to be written, and each time one encounters these things in the sources, it inflicts a loss of respect that I hate to experience. I think it is part of analysing any person to constantly realise that they are lesser than you had hoped, and if you want proof of this, simply try assessing yourself with perfect honesty. What actually happened comes to us from Aristippus himself many years later, said by accident to a scholar named Tissaphernes, who is memorialized in Chariskos outside the very building I am currently writing in. Pairisades had taken the chance to deploy his cavalry in the forests, using the occasion of going to assess and warn Aristippus there as an excuse. Those of his riders who were not accustomed to forest combat, like the true Luthosis, had still used the forest to hide their presence, watching the Kimbri come out towards the hilltop camp. When the Kimbri stopped to rest before the battle, Pairisades attacked them in the middle of the night, quietly killing those in the forests and loudly assaulting those outside. Hence the Kimbri were startled and tried to recover their camp by dragging their things into the trees, but there of course awaited an even harder battle than in the open. And so the Kimbri's army was withered and robbed of its spirit by the true thieves of the night, although perhaps Pairisades committed his thievery for a noble cause, to gift a victory to his son. The invasion force was dispersed, and Aristippus was seen to have returned victorious for a time, although his troops revealed their lack of glory and gold soon enough. People were willing to believe Aristippus had won the day because he was such an unusual person in the eyes of the Himanians that having strange and great feats attached to him was entertaining to them. That is my only explanation for how easily the history makers came to chronicle this brief war in such a staggeringly inaccurate vein. Pairisades stayed in Chrysogus with his son to organize strategic matters. He made treaties with some tribes and sent spies to find the weaknesses of others, all the while encouraged and amused by Aristippus's humorous impressions of the people who came to court for this business. Pairisades, unlike many of his own companions, or most high-minded people, did not find acting to be an especially unsuitable hobby for a royal man. I will not tell you what they schemed, because none of it came to pass, and new plots for war were forced upon them later, so I will allow us to come to those points naturally as we progress. Instead, I shall tell you what was happening to Doraeus and the fate-quaked people of Syria. The prince had summoned a council of the local Ptolemaic generals, who were many and ill-mandated, so that he could imprint on them the new rules of war. He confirmed that they were under orders to supply the materials of life to Alexandria, because King Ptolemy XII wished to make Egypt a part of Yemo's domain. This was for his own satisfaction rather than any demand of the Judeans, and certainly not by the demand of anyone else. The young king would have to learn that Doraeus had pilfered his prize for the conduction of natural magic instead. Wisely keeping this outside of his emphasis, Doraeus explained that to invoke Golden Age power and restore a paradise to the earth, the Ptolemaic men would have to do exactly what he said. They did not go quite that far in their obedience from what I can tell, but their campaign became marginally more reasonable, perhaps calming to the point of only the usual and expected level of violence from an unsophisticated force, raiding villages and towns while leaving temples and important cities intact, this kind of approach. That was an improvement by many accounts, and conversely, it was no different to those who were fated to die to its callous indifference either way. With the affairs of the war returning to the boundaries of what is regular, Doraeus next turned his attention to Edessa. It had been dreadfully ruined and almost emptied of people, although some were beginning to return. The people of the hinterlands were not sure who Doraeus was, only seeing that he appeared to be not unlike the men who had ruled the city before. This brought a measure of acceptance to the new status quo. Doraeus also did his best to express his sympathies and scorned the Ptolemies for what it was worth. It was soon revealed that he was closely in league with them, dispelling his clean reputation. The most practical service he could offer was to remove the bodies of the slain from the city. After all, they had been promised to his cousin and ally. Doraeus did not intend to satisfy such a delivery. Instead, he ordered his few soldiers to prepare parties who would transport groups of the deceased to the outlying villages. There they would be interned in important places, such as sacred groves or near springs, and become a source of good fortune and rich life for the region in the coming years. Many of the soldiers wished to return to Antioch, where business which was almost as hard awaited in spheres more relevant to themselves. Doraeus was wont to let them go, since this benefited him also, and this harmed and delayed his project in Edessa greatly. The prince went out in person to perform labour, so dire was the need for even one more set of hands, and this was seen as both appalling and admirable by the various people who commented on it. From such comments I draw an important anecdote that is usually said to be a myth, but I see no reason why it should not be true. It goes like this. Doraeus had recently taken on a follower from the court of Antioch who had survived the sacking, and this follower suddenly began bawling like an animal when the party entered a certain street. This man ran out and attended to a body in pauper's clothing, and it seemed unlikely that a courtier would ever have met, let alone cared for, the well-being of this fellow in particular. Doraeus pressed for an explanation, and the courtier revealed, through moans and wails, that the body was none other than Elector, king of the Seleukids. How could this be? Such a question leads most to believe this story is nonsense, but it is not so stupendous a thing. Firstly, Elector would have been well known to the courtiers at Antioch, because he often used the city as his principal capital when the business of a given year was focused on his western domain. Secondly, his capital at the time was Antiochia Mygdonia, and I can only apologize for the zealous legacy of a certain King Antiochus the Great for all these like-named cities, but his time has long passed. The city was east of Edessa, being one of the nearest cities. Centuries ago it had been a vassal of the Edessan king. And I mention this because we also know Elector had fled his capital for fear of conspiracy against him, which makes Edessa a perfectly reasonable place for him to have sought refuge. Thirdly, to address the testimony that the deceased wore pauper's clothing, this was not only a possible disguise, but is actually how many of the Seleukid descriptions of Elector depict him. He was known as Elector the Humble, with a most un-Seleukid distaste for luxury, communicated by his drive to be the most unremarkable man in any scene he entered. It was an admirable thing, I will grant, although it did not mark his life or character as an admirable one when balanced against his bountiful faults. I will not make a full assessment here, since a history of the Seleukid Empire is available at most academies, and I find that even amateur writers don't shy from the truth when it comes to Seleukid failings. If only we could say the same of the Romans. So that, and by no other method, was how Elector met his end. It reminds us that each of the tens of thousands of ends the ritual hunt brought was of a person with battles and campaigns to their own lives too, ever unknown to us, and likely even to most who saw that person carrying on their struggles. I like to think of how we are closer than ever before to seeing this sad note to wider life eliminated in our coming golden age. But again, this is a topic for other books. Sticking to history, I will say that Doraeus dispatched the body to Antiochia Mygdonia, and thus triggered the accession of a man named Hieros to the Seleukid throne. Note though that they did not possess a throne at the time, and used a simple stool in a would-be republican chamber converted from a temple complex of the old Assyrians. Hieros sent Doraeus many gifts in return, and gave an assurance that he would not march against Edessa or Bosporan armies for a period of 1 year in recognition of their honour. Doraeus gave the gifts to the surviving leaders within the city, and gave the military truce nothing more than a chuckle, for he had come to know of Aeneas's work, and how it rendered a military campaign within a year rather outside of Seleukid range, let alone when helmed by a retired officer with low-ranked parents and few military achievements. In pithy conclusion, Doraeus stilled turmoil and saw the world clearly, with humanity being his concern and excellence being his craft. This was the kind of behaviour which the lithosis of tradition, the cult of Gwenna, were always singing about. That this influenced Doraeus in his early life is easy to accept. The notion of Paragon deities is fascinating in that it fundamentally posits that men can take on the role of gods in the material world if they study their ancestors well and come to rule their own will in a seemingly supernatural way. Things like this have always been known to all peoples, more or less. The significance of the Paragon deities, as the folk of the deep woods understood them, is that they were not venerating a great man or attempting necessarily to generate greatness in themselves inherently. rather to see individual traits, attitudes, or even single achievements of legendary heroes as aspirational and attainable. In this way, the power of the Lithosis pantheon was enhanced by the addition of new legends with new lessons over time, and these deities were not at odds with each other or hostile to humanity in any way, as so many cosmic gods have shown themselves to be. It would be wrong to say that recognition of these paragons was popular, because the foremost aim of the Scions of Gold was to inform people of more basic information, such as the origin of reality. And even then, the Scions of Gold could be loved in one city and hated in the next. But I would like to note that we see emerging from the masses of written records being made in the Bosporan Empire many references to common songs and sayings that the writers relied upon, and these are dripping with direct or influenced reference to the Paragon deities. Alongside the names of Dies and Dagon, would the likes of Doraeus ever be invoked as a holy example? My view is that this would not be detrimental. Any road, I wished only to tell you that the song-singing traditions that are found everywhere today were already beginning in the writings of the Bosporan Empire in the later years of King Pairisades, and the heroes venerated then were fewer than those now, which is not to be considered a matter of dilution, but of deepening. This, though, is an argument that must be made in person to those traditionalists who insist otherwise, and again I am straying from my duty in this writing, so let there be only these crumbs of useful information to arm you against the famine of ignorance others will invoke. In the terms of a chronicler, these were times of change. Changes I am hardly discussing for all the important details which demand full attention. Beginning with the law, and extending to rhymes of children playing in the street, the roughly defined thing that was the Bosporan Empire was carving its footprint into the world day by day. There was the beginning of a plan to restore the Golden Age, the beginning of an understanding of the need for such a plan, and the first already nearly tyrannical means to enact it upon mankind. Indeed, a hand grandiose enough to offer you all the gold you might ever need must necessarily be grandiose enough also to crush you and torture you into any fate it wills. This is the link between power and morality, and these are things that the emerging generation of Scions of Gold priests had not yet agreed a course upon. It is like trying to generate the teachings of a spirit whom you cannot hear, and you cannot hear them precisely because you do not have their teachings. This is how the world often tumbles along its way, but if you are reading this work, you already have the methods and arms to overcome that woe. So I pray to you for the good of all, you had best read on.